All right. Hello, and welcome to another online presentation. I'm Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service here in Hancock County. Very happy to have you joining us today and talking about managing wildlife in the home landscape. So, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the wildlife that we like to have in our landscape and how to attract them. If you'd like more information on that topic, I would really recommend you can go to the YouTube channel that we have set up for this. If you're watching on YouTube, you're already there. And look for a presentation on bringing bees and butterflies into the home landscape because I go into a lot more detail on establishing gardens for those kinds of wildlife in that presentation. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about that and I'm also going to talk about some of the wildlife that, as much as we do enjoy them, occasionally can cause a little bit of nuisance to us, and what we can do about trying to address that in our home landscape. So, I want to start off talking about attracting some desired wildlife. I know I certainly enjoy watching the butterflies and birds and bunnies and everything else running around my landscape at home. Really brings a lot of enjoyment to watch them when sitting out on my back porch. So, when we're trying to attract wildlife to our home landscape, there are really, the things that we want to take care of for them are the same things we would want to have taken care of for us. So there are three basic needs that we need to address. And the first of these is making sure that they have a food source in our environment that's going to be available to them. And that's really going to do a very important part of attracting them to the landscape. And regardless of what kind of wildlife we're talking about, there are usually some artificial options that we can go with to very easily and very quickly add those resources into our home landscape. And particularly for birds, there are many different mixes of food for birds and bird houses that we can set out and bird feeders that we can set out in the landscape that are really going to provide them a lot of those food resources. I've gone through several different mixes to kind of see what I have good experience with it, and really the black sunflower seeds seem to be the absolute most popular material for all of the birds that I have visiting in my home landscape. But a diversity of different food sources is going to generally attract a broader array of birds into your landscape. Of course, hummingbird feeders are very popular and do a really good job and really interesting to set outside a window. You can see them coming in to feed on that. It's good to have several of them placed around because hummingbirds can be a little bit territorial, and you want to make sure that you have enough feeders out there so they don't really have to fight over that food. Um, so a lot of different options there that are going to be available. Something that you can just have right away as a way to introduce that food source into the landscape. Now, my preference is to provide a natural food source for the animals, and we can do that with plants. So, selecting plants that are going to be really good as a food source for birds, really good as food sources for butterflies, hummingbirds. And again, I would definitely recommend looking at the other presentation that's up on the YouTube channel about attracting birds and butterflies into the landscape because I go into some detail about what kinds of flowers and what kinds of things are going to be really appropriate for bringing those animals into the landscape. And we can really kind of, choose the plants that we have in order to attract the specific animals that we're looking to have in our landscape. Of course, the next thing that we do need to have in landscape for animals is going to be water. And it is important to have a water source that's going to be available and really accessible to the different kinds of animals that are going to be feeding in that. And so, of course, everyone knows about bird baths and putting out feed, areas where the birds are going to be not only be um drinking water, but able to access that water for other things. And even things like butterflies are going to require water as well. And so you want to make sure that that's going to be accessible to them. They're not going to like bird feeders quite as much. They don't want deep pools of water. What you're going to want for them is going to be areas, either damp soil or areas where you have a thin film of water over something like rocks. That way, the butterflies are able to settle on those rocks and take up that water without having to contend with the deeper water. Of course, larger animals can use larger resources. So having a little pool of water is great for things like rabbits and other wildlife that we might want to have around. Shelter is another important component there. Um, and again, there are going to be different requirements for different animals, even different birds. Can be very particular about the type of bird houses that they're going to live in, particularly the diameter of the hole in the birdhouse can be really selective for what birds are going to want to live in that. Again, choosing plants in your landscape, having a diversity of plants and different plant heights is a really great way of providing natural shelter. Leaving areas with brush near the ground is going to provide areas for ground dwelling wildlife. And one of my favorite things to add into the landscape are actually bat houses that provide a really convenient place for bats to be able to reside, particularly away from the eaves of my house, because I don't want them getting into my attic. So again, there are all sorts of artificial, shelters that you can add in. But again, having natural shelter is really the ideal. But it's certainly possible to maintain both of those, to have both that artificial shelter and plenty of natural shelter for them as well. Having shrubs, sort of undisturbed areas, provides really good habitat for a wide range of wildlife. And again, plants can be chosen to promote the species that you're looking for. So I'm going to speak just a little bit about birds. Um, and there are a lot of birds that reside here in Mississippi. We have a range of birds that are here throughout the year that are just a pleasure to watch. Cardinals and blue jays and American robins and eastern bluebirds, different kinds of woodpeckers and sparrows and mockingbirds. So a lot of birds to keep up with and to really enjoy watching in the landscape. The other thing that we can enjoy is that not all of the birds that we see are year-round residents. So during the winter, when it is cold up north, we can have things like birds like the American goldfinch and cedar waxwings and all sorts of different waterfowl coming down to spend the winter here where it's warm, and then return up north as the weather warms up in the spring. We're really fortunate. We've got a lake in our backyard, and we've had all sorts of geese and wild ducks and everything making use of that lake, and they've been a lot of fun to watch over the past few months. When we want to garden for birds, there's some really good things to keep in mind. And one of those is the birds really like to sit on the edges of things where they can get out there and survey their kingdom. So having a wide variety of garden edges really provides them with a lot of places to perch and face open areas. That way they can have a place to retreat to where they feel safe. Or if they're out there hunting for insects, they have a place where they can look over the area and find something to go after. You also want to use a variety of different plant heights because different birds prefer to use different heights. So having trees and then shrubs and then ground covers allows a variety of birds to be able to use that same space. You do want to keep in mind, while a lot of birds do feed on seeds and other things like that, plant material, then a lot of them also do feed on insects. So if you do something like overspray your lawn with pesticide to get rid of the bugs, then you may also be removing that food source. So if you are going to need to do that, and it's possible that you may have a pest that we need to take care of, it is a good idea to add in an artificial food source that's going to be able to maintain the bird population in your environment until the insects come back. And now there are a lot of food plants out there that are really good for birds. I am certainly not going to discuss all of these. I'm just going to kind of comment very quickly that a lot of these not only do a fantastic job of providing food for birds, but are also really attractive in the landscape. Of course, down here in the very south of Mississippi, we treasure the live oaks that we have in our landscapes, and the southern magnolias are absolutely gorgeous throughout the state. Tulip trees are just a really large and really attractive tree. Um, I always really enjoy hollies. I think there's just a great use for them in landscapes as a smaller tree. All sorts of really great, dogwoods and crab apples. American beautyberry is one of my favorite plants, with the really showy berries that they put on in the fall. Of course, we talk about blueberry as a food plant for birds. That might be a time when the birds in our landscape can be a little bit of a nuisance because we want those blueberries, and the birds certainly do enjoy them as well. And so we may have to have a little bit of a competition on who can get to them first. Another great plant for the landscape is red buckeye. Really attractive flowers, does well in our landscapes. We also have some nice perennials like purple coneflower or echinacea, does really well. The salvias are gorgeous. Of course, birds love sunflower seeds, so having sunflowers is a great way to draw them in as well. For our hummingbirds, the hummingbird that we're normally going to see is really just the one species. There are many more species of hummingbirds that are native to North America, but fortunately, hummingbirds, the ruby-throated hummingbird, is really easy to attract in with commercially available feeders. A lot of people will purchase the nectar or the sugar water essentially to go into those feeders. When they buy the feeder, a lot of times that comes with a red food, some sort of red food coloring. That red coloring is not really necessary at all. The birds are going to find that sugar source regardless. And you can make it at home very easily just by dissolving 1 part sugar in 4 parts water and boiling it to completely dissolve the granules of sugar. Add it to your feeder, and the hummingbirds will come. I do always include a note. I've never actually seen anybody add honey into hummingbird food, but I do always include a note not to do that because it can actually be damaging to the hummingbirds. As I mentioned earlier when I was talking about food sources, you do want to place feeders at several locations around the landscape. Male hummingbirds, particularly, are very territorial, will try to drive each other off. And as fun as that is to watch, it's better to include several feeders so you can have more hummingbirds in your landscape. Of course, there are a variety of plants as well that can be chosen as really great resources for hummingbirds as a great way to have them in your landscape as well. Now, some people have mixed feelings about bats. I am very fond of them. I think they're a great animal to have in the home landscape. Um, they tend to feed on small insects, particularly in the evening. So a single little brown bat, that is its common name, can eat about 600 mosquitoes in an hour. And while I'm not sure that we can really consider that an effective way to reduce the mosquito population, I will engage in any activity that keeps that population just a little bit lower. So some species are migratory. A lot of them will hibernate in caves or hollows in trees. Again, really easy to add in bat houses in order to give them a place to nest, and really interesting to watch in the evening as they flit around hunting for insects. Now, bats do prefer kind of warm, warm, kind of dark areas in order to have a place where they can shelter during the day. Bat houses are a great way to attract them into your landscape. You want to put them pretty high up, so they need to be about 15 feet above the ground. So you want to put them up on a tree or other stand. It's going to be pretty good, pretty good distance above the ground, in an area it's going to get some sun, be able to keep it warm, and you don't want to attach them directly into your house. You don't want to give them the idea that your house is a place where they're going to be able to find shelter. And if you are going to attract bats, go around your house. Make sure you don't have any openings in your eaves or any vents that don't have a cover on them, because we don't want to wind up with bats in our attic. Uh, that being said, having them in your landscape, if you put those houses, put those bat houses away from your actual house, they really tend to go to those houses, and you'll have a good experience there. One of the reasons why you want to put them up high is the way that bats fly. They, of course, you always see pictures of them hanging upside down, and they kind of drop out to pick up some speed. So they need to have a little bit of distance above ground so they can fly really easily. Of course, butterfly gardens, one of my favorite things. We do want to make sure that we incorporate food both for the adult butterflies and for our and for the larvae or the caterpillars. And it's always also important to remember that butterflies are cold-blooded, so they need sunny areas to warm up in the mornings. In the morning, you will occasionally see them sitting on a branch or sitting on a convenient open space in the sun, kind of moving their wings back and forth to get that warmth moving through their body. Oftentimes, they will hide under leaves or shrubs at night. And if you have a small wood pile or kind of rough area, that does provide a really great area for them to shelter. They will just use mud puddles or areas with gravel that has water in it to get water and minerals. And often you'll actually see them kind of gathered around in a circle around a puddle, and they're picking up the water and minerals there that they need. Really good thing to add in are some good flat stones. Those flat stones are going to collect some warmth from the sun, and that really gives them a nice area to warm up in the morning. Of course, having food plants for your butterflies is going to be really important. The most famous of those, of course, is milkweed. There are all sorts of different kinds of milkweed that are native. A lot of people are really concerned about tropical milkweed because there is an issue with the buildup of a disease that can damage monarch butterflies. If you cut your tropical milkweed back in the fall, you really do kind of prevent the buildup of that pathogen. And it is perfectly okay to use tropical milkweed. That being said, there are some really nice, really gorgeous native milkweeds that I think are a really good replacement, but they are a little bit more difficult to come across. If you're looking for native milkweeds, Crosby Arboretum does have some plant sales. It's located in Picayune, Mississippi, and I would encourage you to look there. Of course, we want to provide food for a lot more than just that one butterfly. One thing that I always encourage people to do if they're interested in attracting butterflies and having butterfly gardens is to have an herb garden, because if you have an herb garden, you are providing a really good food source for a wide range of different caterpillars. Plants like parsley and dill do a very good job as caterpillar resources. And then there are a lot of flowers that do fantastic as resources for the adults. Of course, lantana is a great plant for butterflies. Joe Pye weed, despite having weed in the name, is a really great plant for the landscape. Does well in kind of a diverse area. Really great resource for butterflies as well. And there are some newer dwarf varieties that stay a little bit smaller and work really well in smaller areas. But plants like all of the asters do really well. Um, I always encourage you to put in something like the echinaceas or coneflowers, and just do a really great job of providing food. If you got some citrus plants, keep an eye out for them. There are the caterpillars for the giant swallowtail that show up on citrus plants, and they can feed a little bit on the leaves of your citrus, but rarely do enough damage to be a concern. And they too turn into an absolutely gorgeous butterfly, even though the caterpillars are kind of disturbing to look at. They're in order to escape predation by birds, they look like bird leavings. So not the most attractive caterpillar, but turn into an absolutely gorgeous butterfly. Squirrels are kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes I talk to people and they're just really, really want to attract squirrels into their landscape. And sometimes they're trying to figure out how to get rid of them. Um, I do encourage people not to intentionally feed squirrels. As you know, sometimes the struggle is to keep the squirrels out of your bird feeders, but there are feeders that are designed specifically for squirrels, and I try to get people not to include them. Those feeders can encourage the population of squirrels to get higher than can be supported by the habitat, the carrying capacity of the habitat for the population of squirrels. And that, when that happens, they're going to try to find food and can occasionally, try to eat you out of house and home, or even damage trees in your landscape by chewing off the bark. They can also start looking for nesting sites, and that can wind up with squirrels in your attic, which is something that is not the most fun in the world to deal with. But there are some great plants that we can include in our landscape that do a really good job of supporting squirrels and keeping the natural level of the population there. So, one of my favorite plants in the landscape is red maples. You get that gorgeous fall color, and red maples do a really good job of supporting squirrels. The hickory plants, of course, with their hickory nuts. Fringe trees are absolutely gorgeous, and make a good habitat for squirrels, as well as providing a lot of ornamental features. Chickasaw plums, and there's certainly a variety beyond that. Pecan trees, of course, are another really good option for you there. Now, I want to spend a good bit of my time today talking about some of the animals that we can have in our landscape that are what we might call a nuisance. And I want to start off just by saying that there's nothing wrong with any of these animals, despite the fact that they can occasionally be a little bit of a problem for us, may cause damage to our landscape. Ideally, we want to find a way to coexist with them and make sure that we're not harming them and they're not harming us. So, as much as possible, I encourage people to be gentle with the plants, with the animals in their landscape, and not do any harm unless they really have to. That being said, we do have some general ways that we can deal with nuisance wildlife, and the most important one, in my mind, we talk about attracting beneficial wildlife, or attracting wildlife that we enjoy. And to do that, we need to provide them with food sources and water and shelter. And in order to get rid of nuisance wildlife, what we need to do is essentially the opposite. We want to remove their food sources. We want to remove areas where they can shelter. And that way we can just encourage them to go find another place to go on. There are times when we can also use just simple exclusion where we can put up fences and things like that or barriers. And there are some repellents to talk about. And when we get to the very extreme, we can talk about direct removal. And I would encourage you, if you're considering actually having an animal physically removed from your landscape, that is a really good time to call a pest control professional. Um, any animal, if it's cornered, can be a can be defensive, and so safety is certainly a very important concern when you're talking about that. So I would encourage people, generally speaking, my very simple rule for wildlife is to never touch an animal that you're not intimately familiar with. So if it's not your pet, it's a really good idea not to come in physical contact with it. But that being said, moles are a common problem that we face. I get a lot of calls asking about how to manage moles in the landscape. They prefer the same kind of soils that we want for most of our landscape, which are really nice, moist, sandy loam soils. And they tend to avoid heavy clay soils. But we, of course, don't want heavy clay soils either because it's difficult to grow our plants in our landscape that way. The biggest nuisance with moles is that they construct tunnels and underground passageways all around your landscape. And so that leads to the appearance of their tunnels on the surface, areas of our grass that aren't particularly performing well. And what they're doing is they're hunting around and looking for insects and things like earthworms in the soil. So they feed on beetle grubs and spiders and earthworms, things like that. Their favorite food being those white grubs, which are kind of beetle larvae that we find underneath the soil in our yards. And we tend to see a lot of their activity during sort of the warm, wet months. And so I get a lot of calls asking how to get rid of them. And the first and best thing that we can do in order to get rid of moles in our landscape is to take away their food source. So the first thing that I tell people to do if you have a mole problem is to go out and treat your yard with an insecticide that's going to get rid of those beetle populations. That's going to take away their food source, and when their food source goes away, they'll go away too. I don't generally encourage people to use repellents. I don't think that they're anywhere near as effective as just going out there and managing those insect populations and taking away their food source. And I have not had a good experience at all with any of the mole traps. Moles, like a lot of wild animals, are what we call neophobic. They don't like new things. And so if you insert a trap into their tunnel, they see that. And I would really wonder, about the appearance of a black plastic tube in the hallway in my house. And the moles are kind of the same way. So I haven't had a good experience with those. And in the worst case, you have a mole that, a dead mole you have to dispose of. In my mind, an even worse case, you have a live mole trapped in in that tube, and you have to figure out what to do with the live mole. And I'm not sure that I have a really good answer for what you should do with it at that point. So go out there, treat for those insect populations, reduce their food source, and your moles will go away. And it really does solve the problem. Very similarly, we have armadillos. We tend to see armadillos moving around at night. That's when they're primarily active, and they tend to dig around in ground litter. And they're doing the same thing that the moles are. They're searching for food, which includes insects and grubs and small invertebrates. that they feed on. Um, One thing that is a little bit unique about armadillos is when they're startled, they tend to just hop up straight up into the air, or occasionally they'll hunker down. But that does not have while that may startle any predator that might be dealing with them, that is one of the reasons why they occasionally are found dead on the side of the road. Armadillos are not sneaky. They make a lot of noise. They're very well protected by that hardened outer skin. Um, and I do encourage people not to, again, don't come in contact with armadillos. Don't come in contact with any wild animal. While they're pretty, they're not aggressive by any stretch of the imagination. Just kind of as a curiosity, they are known to carry the bacterium associated with leprosy, which is Mycobacterium leprae. There is no evidence that that actually will transfer to humans through contact with armadillos. But I always use that as a great way to convince people that maybe touching them is not the thing that you want to do. Again, the ideal way to get rid of armadillos is to get rid of their food source. If you treat for insects in your yard, get rid of the white grubs that are in there. That is going to do a very good job of convincing the armadillo that it needs to look somewhere else for food. There aren't any effective repellents that can be used, so that's not very effective. I do know a lot of people who will put out live traps for them. I grew up calling them tender traps, but these are often baited with something like apples or bananas, something overripe, and that can convince the armadillo to go into it. Armadillos are not don't use their eyes that much. They primarily navigate by smell, and they like to hang around on the borders of things. So the traps tend to be a little bit more effective if you put some wood wings to kind of help guide that armadillo into the trap. Um, the other issue again that you face when you have the animal trapped is what do you do with it then? It's generally not a good idea to just move the animal and drop it off somewhere else and turn it into someone else's problem. So again, I really encourage you. The most effective way to manage this is just treat for those insect populations, reduce the food that they have in the landscape, and let them make their own way off. Now, I have to freely admit, I love raccoons. I think they're just absolutely fun to watch. But I try to make sure that I get all of my raccoon watching done by video. Raccoons prefer areas near water, but they can be really common in suburbs and urban environments because they do a really good job of surviving in that kind of area. They will den in hollow trees, they'll burrow in the ground, they'll live in brush piles or rock crevices. They really like areas beneath decks or in an accessible outbuilding. And they'll eat, pretty much anything. They'll eat plant material. They'll eat small animals. And one of their favorite resources is pet food that gets left out overnight. And again, there's a lot of food resources for them in urban environments, either people's pet foods or dumpsters and trash cans that they can raid. And so you can get a pretty good population of raccoons in an urban area. And a lot of times people kind of enjoy having them around. But I don't think it's a good idea to feed the raccoons. We don't want to draw them into us. Despite the fact that they are cute little bandits, they are wild animals. We want to make sure that we're careful about them. Make sure that you're using a garbage can that has a secure lid, doesn't allow itself to be overturned. Don't leave any pet food outside unprotected at night. Don't feed them, and particularly, again, approaching a wild animal is not a great idea. Um, make sure you're closing off and putting physical barriers down for exclusion for areas like underneath porches or underneath decks. And if you do have a population of raccoons that you need to remove, again, let me stress that the best thing you can do at that point is to hire a professional. They are going to be a lot safer at removing that raccoon than I would, than you would be able to be. And I don't want anybody to get hurt. On a somewhat easier note, crawfish. I get this question a great deal. You see these mounds that come up in our yards. We call them chimneys. And those chimneys, particularly in areas where we have, kind of a really wet area, it's holding a lot of moisture. Not only are those chimneys kind of unsightly, it's not what we want our lawns to look like, they also are really a nuisance for our lawnmowers, can cause damage and a lot of effort to clean up. So we want to figure out a way to reduce these populations. And unfortunately, there's really no pesticide that's labeled for controlling them. So there's nothing we can go out and spray over the court, over the area of our landscape to get rid of them. We wouldn't want to do that anyway. Some of these crawfish populations, dependent on the crawfish and where you're at, some of them are actually threatened or protected species, and we don't want to do any harm to them. One technique that can be used to get rid of the crawfish is to use lye. Lye can be purchased at big box stores, usually in the plumbing department. Um, it's also used to make soap. And you can put a tablespoon of lye down each individual chimney, and that can be used as a way to get rid of the crawfish. I do encourage you, if you are going to use lye this way, make sure you wear some gloves, good nitrile gloves or something like that. Wear a face mask, to keep from breathing it in. Lye is a highly caustic material and can cause injury, so I would be caution you just to be careful with that. Another animal that I get a lot of calls about are snakes in home landscapes. People are very nervous about snakes, and we do have snakes here in Mississippi that are poisonous. But far more commonly, snakes are doing us a great benefit in our landscape, reducing mouse populations, rat populations, and I would encourage you again, if you have a snake in your landscape, just the best thing you can possibly do is to just leave it be. If you are going to have a problem, anyone of the people who do get bitten by snakes, the majority of them are trying to either kill it or handle it, and so I would encourage you, unless it is an absolute necessity, that the best thing to do with a snake at all times is to leave that snake be. They're not going to cause you any property damage. Again, they really can be beneficial because they're actually removing pests from your landscape. And we do tend to see them more often in the early spring or in the fall because they're either out looking for food or they're looking for an area to hibernate. Again, while we do have some venomous species here in Mississippi, a couple of different kinds of rattlesnake or three different kinds of rattlesnake, the water moccasin or cottonmouth being really common, and the copperhead. Far more often, the snakes that I encounter are either water snakes or black racers or rat snakes, and they are absolutely harmless and just want to go out there and hunt for mice. So I encourage you to leave them be. If you do want to, just kind of protect your area around your home or discourage snakes. One thing that works very effectively: just make sure you're mowing closely around your property. Store firewood away from the residences. That just removes any shelter sites for them. Doesn't give them a place where they want to hang out. Make sure that you're not over mulching in your landscape beds. And that really isn't so much about discouraging snakes as much as it is about discouraging the small animals that they would feed on. If you have any cracks or crevices in buildings, you can fill those up with hardware cloth or metal mesh or mortar, and make sure that all your doors and windows have good tight fitting screens. One of the easiest and best things you can do for controlling snake populations is just to put out traps for mice and other rodents. The best ones for those are the baited traps. Usually they look like a black box with a hole, and a block of a poison is put in there, and the mice go in there and feed and go off to pass away. And if, again, like any nuisance animal, if you reduce that food source, you reduce the population of that animal, and you don't have a problem with them in your landscape. So I do want to just really quickly mention, because I do a lot of vegetable gardening. I can get a little bit frustrated with birds who want to eat my vegetables before I get a chance to. I've had particular problems with this with tomatoes, where the birds seem to audaciously take one or two bites out of it and then just leave it on the plant. So I often do get asked, how do I discourage the birds? One of the easiest ways to do this is just with mesh. If you put a frame up, even something simple like a couple of stretches PVC that go over the garden area, you can put that mesh over the garden when you're not working in it, and that will keep the birds out, keep them being able to directly interact with the plants. Reflective tapes and reflective, even pie plates that can hang from areas near the garden can discourage some birds. The trick with that is that the movement and the shifting light is kind of what they find offensive and don't want to be near. And you want to move those things around in the landscape to kind of keep changing it up, because just like anything, after a little while, the birds kind of get used to it. Even the sort of the fake owls that you can set up, those do have some impact and help with birds a little bit. But again, you need to move them around because eventually they'll figure out that it's not moving and they'll sort of lose their fear of it. On kind of a larger scale, there are air cannons that can be used that will, on a set time, will let out a large noise, kind of like a cannon going off. And that startles birds away from the area. Not something I would recommend for use by homeowners, but it does get used at the commercial scale. Um, and I will freely admit that the first time I ever encountered one as a very young person, I was unprepared. And they will not only startle birds out of the agricultural field, but they will startle young people as well. So you can use those sort of sound deterrents. Again, not something I would recommend for a homeowner, but something that does get it used at a broader scale. Um, Probably the most frequent problem animal that people ask me about is how to deal with deer in the home landscape. Uh, Deer come into our home landscapes. The deer population can be quite high, and just like anything, they are coming out looking for food, and they really like areas where you have kind of a mixture of fields and woods. And a lot of the towns that we live in kind of have that quality. I know on my drive home from MSU in Starkville, I would very frequently see deer coming across the streets as I was driving home. I've certainly seen a lot of them down here in the southern part of the state as I've been driving around. And they are particularly active, dawn and dusk. And they can be a problem simply because if they're hungry, they'll eat our plants, they'll eat things in the home landscape. And they really are kind of the primary complaint that I get about wildlife. They eat about 7 pounds of food a day, and they'll eat a very wide range of plants. So they'll go after our ornamental plants and our vegetable plants, even our fruit plants. And they particularly enjoy the really soft new growth on that plant. So clipping that away can very seriously impact the growth of the plant. If you have a small area you want to keep them out of, electric fencing does absolutely work. That is great for a small garden. And you do want to keep that electrified. It's a good idea to have two different kind of have a depth. So you can see in the picture there, there's an outer fence and then an inner fence with the different heights. Deer don't have very good depth perception, so that kind of keeps them out of that area, and they'll learn to get away with it, but to keep away from it rather. But you do need to keep that fence charged up in order to keep discouraging them from getting into the garden. Um, and they generally, a lot of people kind of think of them jumping over fences, but they do really tend to try to go through it rather than over it. I have seen some really nice designs. This is not one from here. People have designed fenced areas that make it more difficult for the deer to get in as a way to keep them out. That being said, sometimes the deer are very determined to try and get over that fence, and I don't know if I want to have the experience of trying to get that deer unstuck. Um, there are some repellents that are out there on the market. I either tend to have an offensive taste or smell bad, and you may need to try to use several different things to figure out what's going to be effective. Generally, the ones that are based off of egg protein tend to be the most effective ones. And it works if you have sort of moderate numbers in a small area to apply it on. You're also going to have to reapply it as the population, as you might have rainfall or things like that that are going to wash that repellent away. Um, Deer resistant plants are a great thing for the landscapes. If you know you have this problem, it is important to keep in mind that when I say deer resistant, it's kind of like a water resistant watch. When the deer are hungry enough, they'll eat anything, but they prefer some plants over others. When the population is high, or if there's stress in the population, even a plant that would be deer resistant can be damaged. They really prefer that soft early vegetation with higher water content. Some things that you want to look for deer resistant plants: if it has thorny or prickly leaves or stems, if it has a really strong scent or a really strong taste like herbs, anything that produces kind of a latexy sap or has hairy leaves. So some good example of plants that are kind of deer resistant: crepe myrtles and dogwoods and bald cypress are all good examples for trees. For shrubs, things like angel's trumpet, hollies, which can be trees as well, sweet olive are all kind of deer resistant, and things like African daisies and begonias, and calla lilies are all really effective bedding plants that are kind of resistant to deer as well. Uh, just in terms of personal experience, the plant that I've found that seems to be the most resistant is rosemary. It has a really strong aroma to it, really strong taste, does not appear to be a plant they particularly care for. So putting a few rosemary plants around is kind of a somewhat effective way to discourage them from being in the area. So I really appreciate your time today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Um, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions you may have.